Welcome, Dr. Lisa Diller, to this first Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists video podcast. I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Dragoslava Santrac, managing editor of the Encyclopedia, or the ESDA as we call it, using its acronym. I am David Trim, I'm the editor of the Encyclopedia, and we're joined by one of our associate editors, Dr. Lisa Diller, who is head of the history department at Southern Adventist University. Welcome, Dr. Diller.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you, Dr. Trim and Slava, and for all the viewers that are joining us too.
So this is the first in excitement in a series of video podcasts about the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, the ESDA, which is released on July 1st and is the Adventist Church's first online reference work. It has more than 2,000 entries from around the world on a wide variety of topics, including articles on Adventist missionaries, evangelists, institutions, beliefs, and organizations as well. So if you haven't looked at the ESDA website, please do so. It's at encyclopedia.adventist.org. That's encyclopedia.adventist.org. And the exciting thing there is not only are there the articles, there are thousands of photographs as well, most of which have never been seen. And Dr. Diller, I think you might agree with me, there's about 10 photographs that every Adventist knows. They're of Ellen White and James White and J.N. Andrews and maybe a couple of others. And we see those again and again and again. Now we've got thousands of photographs, most of which have never been seen. But this brings me to an interesting question, which is, is there a kind of familiarity that breeds contempt about Adventist history, that we think we know it and therefore we kind of discount it?
Oh, I think that's true for sure. As somebody who myself, I don't study Adventist history, lifelong Adventist, kind of traditional Adventist education. I definitely kind of felt like I sort of knew Adventist history, and this project has been so exciting for me, not just as a historian, getting to bring my skills as a historian to help with the mission of my church, but as a lay person in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, just be the world opening up in terms of how rich and deep our history is, and way beyond kind of the traditional story was told, which kind of was more of the story of how we developed our theology, how the church was maybe organized at the beginning, Ellen White's life, and then we sent missionaries around the world, and the end. That's kind of how it seemed. Not very exciting, not as exotic as other people's history, that seemed more interesting. And this has just opened up a world to me.
So tell us, what has your role been in the ESTA project? Because as you remarked, you haven't, in the past at least, been a scholar of Adventist history per se. So tell us about what you've done, and also what did you find rewarding about it?
Sure. Well, I'm a historian of what we call the early modern world. So the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, Protestant Reformation, and the Atlantic world. So it overlapped with some of the things that are interesting to us as Seventh-day Adventists in our history. I mean, I got interested in those themes from reading The Great Controversy as a child, which is deeply important to our church's history. So as a historian, I was formed by, our great controversy idea of history. So I think I felt welded into that. But I was asked to be part of this as a consulting editor, which means what I bring to the table is my skills as a historian, thinking about the kinds of questions historians find interesting in other arenas, and therefore the kinds of questions that we should ask of our own church's history, perhaps. Because if you only know about our church's history from within the church, you might not realize what kind of interesting subjects are going on in scholarship. And we want this encyclopedia to be useful not only to our church members, but to scholars and people who find Adventists interesting and who are coming and we want to be integrated into what is helpful to the world in terms of Christian scholarship.
And we also want it to be at the cutting edge of scholarship.
Right. Because we've got great scholars, we have great history. And so the idea was that we would bring consulting editors in different disciplines to ask some of the questions that people in those disciplines are asking. And because I'm part of projects where we're looking at Christian history in other denominational lines, and I even study some Islamic history, I kind of had an idea of what sorts of things are being asked and done that would bless the world and also bless us. So I came to the project as a consulting editor to help ask those questions and maybe propose some ideas and to comment on what we were doing. And also,
So,
go ahead.
you are in fact president-elect of the Conference on Faith and History, I think.
I'm one step away from president-elect, so I'm the program chair, and then president-elect, and then president. So
A future president, at least. And the Conference on Faith and History, because many people won't know, is an association, a professional association of people who teach and research history, mostly in the United States, but who overtly are believers and bring that to bear on their history. So there is a good example of why you were asked to be a consultant editor.
Yes, and I would want Adventists to be part of that. When I go to those conferences where people are talking about American Christianity, and there's so little discussed about Adventists, and just the little I know, now I study the 17th century world, not 19th and 20th century American history, but I already know as a practicing Adventist that we overlap with some of these things, and they aren't calling on our history. They aren't using us as examples of this. They aren't seeing how we participated in this. And that's partly because we haven't always studied ourselves very well, and we haven't always made ourselves available out there to bless the world of scholarship in this way. So that was a big part of why I was excited about being part of this project and honored to be asked to bring my historian's view to bear on this.
And did you find it rewarding?
Oh, yes. I found it very rewarding. Not only have I found it rewarding as a layperson, but I found it rewarding as a scholar. So I've been able to contribute to the wider world of Christian scholarship through the things I'm doing with the encyclopedia. So I brought so the other roles that I've played in the Adventist Encyclopedia, in addition to being consulting editors, I'm writing some articles. So I've gotten to learn more about Adventist history, and I also do some peer review of articles. Those are two separate processes that I've gotten to be involved in. We can come back to some of those later, perhaps. But some of the things that I've done, I now get to bring that knowledge that I have as a scholar to bear on to the Conference on Faith and History, to be precise. Multiple conferences now that I've gone to, I have brought projects from that first came to my attention. Some of them are actually things I've worked on for the encyclopedia, and some of them are things that I started to learn about and I chose to kind of expand on for the Conference on Faith and History itself. So I've benefited as a scholar from being part of this. And then I've also benefited as a layperson from being part of this. And again, being inspired by the richness of my church. I've benefited from the personal relationships. Let's not make any mistake about that, because this project, like so many of our Adventist projects, as it needs to be and is a global project. So as Adventists, we are not. I always shock my friends that are both Christian and non-Christian when I talk about how little of our church is in North America, and how much of it is global. And so I have benefited from. So our encyclopedia is deeply global and is rooted in sort of an equal way all around the world, with editors from each of those places. And so when we've come together once a year, you can't imagine how vital that is, that we've come together and that I've learned through personal relationships with people about things about my church around the world.
Yes, Dr. Diller, I'm so glad that our viewers can see how passionate you are about Adventist history and about the ESDA project. And I just want to say that really our entire team is full of enthusiasm about the project and making Adventist history alive. And without people like you, this project wouldn't have been possible. Now, you didn't mention one important thing that you have been doing, namely, you were able to transmit that passion and enthusiasm to your students in the classroom, and you were able to engage them in the ESDA project. So tell us, please, how did that go? What did your students learn from being engaged in the project?
Well, this has been a deeply gratifying part of being part of this project, I have to say. I wouldn't have had the imagination, sadly, of how my students could potentially be part of this and how much it would mean to Adventist undergraduates. And as I teach undergraduates, so graduate students and high school students are going to be in different situations, but I imagine there's some similar kinds of both blessings and challenges that might come. How much it would mean to them and to me to have them involved in what we would call like institutional heritage is what they call it, you know, in the academic level. When you start realizing, hey, I'm resting on the shoulders of other people in the past, and I'm going to pass this institution I've been part of to people in the future, that the Lord tarry, and that I have a stake in it, you know. So just that, let alone the other kinds of blessings that come from studying history. So part of what it did is it gave me imagination as a teacher in terms of pedagogy to think about how could I include young scholars, young writers in this project.
And how did you?
Yeah.
How did you?
So I had to have some imagination about my classes. So again, my primary area is not teaching Adventist history. So I actually don't have any classes on Adventist history that I teach. So I had to think, how could I? And so I thought about what is it my students learn by being part of this. So they learn skills of research, they learn writing well, and depending on what I chose to do is think about the articles that would be appropriate for them to write. And so I thought about, well, what kinds of articles help contribute to their historical knowledge and orientation. So I used a lot of biographies in my classes. So because last year, 2019, if you don't know this, in the United States, we were celebrating the centennial of women getting the right to vote. So I taught a class for the first time on women's civil rights, which is not something I taught on before, but the students wanted that. It seemed like 100 years is a good time to do that. And so we have a lot of biographies of women that we're being very specific with this encyclopedia about integrating the whole of our church and the people who've influenced it.
And so you were able to assign some of your students to write on those kinds of biographies?
That's exactly right. And so I had a nursing student who wrote on one of the pioneers of nursing. I had actually a woman who had spent her whole life as a laywoman working for civil rights in Ohio. And I had a young woman who's from Ohio that got to write on her. And so what I would say to teachers, because I would love to encourage more teachers to do this, is in North America anyway, I know Doug Morgan has a really effective page where he's put up lists.
A web page.
A web page, that's correct. A web page that he has put up lists of people who need to be written on. And some of them, these are small articles. So some of them we don't know very much about these people. And so my students have been able to access the General Conference archive. So one of the benefits is not only that they are learning about interesting people, they're learning how to write and research, but now they're becoming deeper connected to the range of publications that our churches have done, that our church has done in the past. They know where to go for it. Our archives, the General Conference archives page that you all oversee is rich with digitized resources. As a person who studies early modern history, I was shocked at how much could be done digitally, you know, and so my students have gotten to do a lot of research that way. And sometimes as a teacher, you might be worried, like, these students can't maybe all write at the level that you need for an encyclopedia. And that's true. And so some of those articles are not going to be published, but the students still benefited. They were inspired. Some of them found out like that what we might call secular scholarship knew about these women or these people and that they were finding information about them in newspapers that we did not publish. And they didn't realize how influential these Adventist lay people were in their field.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And so even for students who perhaps didn't reach the bar of excellence for being included in the encyclopedia, they've been given what, a new love for their church? Or for
Right. Right. A real sense of excitement. In fact, that was something that came out of my women's history class, which I was not expecting. They said, we wish we had more of this about Adventist women specifically, is what they said, because it was a women's history class. But they were thinking, I know that they didn't realize they were also speaking about the whole church, because we didn't know this stuff about our church. And I was moved by that level of interest in students that I would have thought might not actually be that interested.
No, this is really amazing, Lisa, to hear that students benefited spiritually and academically. And I believe it's time for us, for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to trust their young people even more, especially in these academic pursuits. As you said, some articles will not be published, maybe not now, but later, if they keep on working, improving. I think it would be wonderful to see more of your students' articles published. And as you said, you did not regret involving your students. You would recommend other teachers to do the same.
And what I would also like to say is that it's not just encyclopedia articles. So in a different class that I had, because of my work with the encyclopedia, I've gotten my students to be more interested in writing about their own institutions and doing research projects I teach at Southern Adventist University. So they have access to the student newspapers and the yearbooks and things like that, and to do more research on those, and then to encourage them to publish that in our local historical journal, because it's local history, but also our Adventist paper, so they get publication, credit, and they learn how to do that. But what the encyclopedia is going to help us do is help us do those kinds of local church history projects, because now our students can access the articles that are kind of the more big picture articles in writing this.
They can contextualize, but also, and it's very encouraging what you say, because obviously, we are wanting more students to write for the encyclopedia. We still have a couple of thousand articles that need to be written, and many of them are short, and one doesn't have to have a PhD to be able to write them competently and soundly.
Yes.
At the same time, what we also want is for the encyclopedia to be a spark that ignites a wider passion for Adventist history in our church. And so if some of your students are writing on things that aren't even for the encyclopedia, that's good too, because we want the encyclopedia to make people aware of our history and to make them excited about the history of this church. Now, that prompts a question. You, as you say, are an historian of the early modern era. And as it happens, Dr. Santrac is an Old Testament scholar, and I am also an historian of the early modern period. Is there a sense here of saying to our colleagues in other disciplines, Adventist history needs you, and it's an exciting area it's wide open because so few people work on it, and you've got the opportunity to do something new, but it could even be faith affirming for you. Is that one of the lessons you would draw from your
absolutely.
experience?
That whether we're talking about cultural aspects, whether we're talking about psychology, literature, the sciences, and other academic disciplines, if you're teaching on a high school level and you're teaching in English, journalism, people that are working in media, there is scholarship to be done for the encyclopedia, and your scholarship is going to be benefited but because of the encyclopedia. So it's, I would encourage anyone who's doing research in that to start using the encyclopedia even for what we have now, and we're going to keep building on. And you may come up with things that need to be included in it and submit those to other editors later, because the encyclopedia itself is going to inspire more work.
Yes. Yeah.
So if I may, I would just say the message is Adventist history, not only for historians of Adventism.
Yeah.
Dragoslava?
Yeah, well, definitely, I agree. And I would tell my colleagues who are in biblical scholarship that the set of skills we have developed, the set of research skills, for biblical history and analysis could be applied to do the research in Adventist history. And I would say that we already have deep appreciation for biblical history. Well, as somebody said recently, Adventist history is almost like a third book of Acts, like a continuation of that narrative of God's leading of his people in the course of time. So yes, and especially in teaching, sometimes we need to use illustrations to encourage students to draw their attention, to highlight a point. Why not use real stories from encyclopedia instead of some made-up stories? and I think people will appreciate this real experience, and not something that is like thousands years ago, like, oh, something happened in Babylonia or Mesopotamia, but something that happened like 50 years ago that's very close to us. I think our students would appreciate that very much, and church members in churches when we preach.
And you know, Dragoslava, I think that's a great point, which is that when the encyclopedia is up and it has so many articles available, and as they keep having more added, this isn't just a resource for people who think, oh, I might want to write for it. It is a resource for teachers. Would you? And I haven't taught now for quite some time, Lisa. So, you know, what do you think of that? That even for people who aren't teaching history, but that there would be articles that could be used for teaching in a whole range of classroom environments.
Absolutely. There's super interesting things about particular people that have done interesting things. The biographies themselves are super rich. But then when you think about global travel, the cultural elements. When you think about people, if you're an English person, you think about people who were writers and influencers kind of in the past. Of course, when I think about people who teach religion, that makes a lot of sense. When you think about missionaries and issues that have been faced. But even in more general social sciences, I think there's a lot to be said for being able to pull from, and we start with what we know, and you can make analogies based on what we know for what you're trying to teach students. It's much more effective.
We need, unfortunately, to wrap up. We could keep talking for ages, and perhaps we'll need to do another podcast with Dr. Diller. But as we wrap up, just sum up for us again. Is Adventist history, is the encyclopedia something that can be appealing to young people? Because encyclopedia, you say that it's a great big heavy word. You think of great big heavy volumes that no one could ever possibly read or may even want to read. Is this really something that can be exciting for young people?
Absolutely. So I think young people are hungry for stories of ordinary people and issues, and to know that their church has been dealing with issues. So one of the suggestions I proposed for an article that we may or may not get written someday is about Adventists and espionage. That's an interesting thing.
We do have, sorry for interrupting, we do have a topic on the list.
That's
and an author writing it. Yes, I can't wait to read the article.
I know. And that's exciting because, again, I think when you know that there's been people who have influenced music, who've influenced politics, who participated, who had to wrestle with complicated issues, like what do? Do you spy on behalf of your country? What are the issues if you do that or don't do that as a missionary or somebody else? Our students need to know they are not the first people to address some of these issues, and that those who have gone before, when I think about the people I've been able to write about, they are ordinary people, but they've had flourishing lives in following what God asked them to do. And as I think about studying people in the past, I think for our students to know it's not mysterious. It can kind of seem like these people were somehow geniuses or saints or so much greater than we were that it seems impossible for me to do any of that stuff. And the other thing is they sometimes think that everything that they got here with, these institutions they get to be part of, the summer camp they get to go to, the school that they attend, the church, that it just somehow magically got here, that it's always been there. And when they get to hear the stories of the people that bought the land and raised the money and had the vision and what challenges they wrestled, and sometimes they had to shut things down and restart them later, that it can make it seem less mysterious and more something that, hey, I also can make my steps and work to also build the kingdom until Jesus comes.
Yes,
Thank
so
you.
very true, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lisa Diller from Southern Adventist University, the consultant editor for history for the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. And we invite you to read the articles by Dr. Diller, which we didn't get the chance to talk about, maybe another time.
Next time.
Articles. Read them and the other nearly 2,500 articles at encyclopedia.adventist.org. Again, Dr. Diller, thank you for being with us, and we invite you to join us again soon with another ESDA editor and new stories from the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists online. Thank you, and God bless.